Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. The people who change your life are rarely the ones you choose to sit beside. Sometimes they're the ones you spend years trying to avoid. The quiet hum of private jet engines blended with the steady patter of rain against the oversized windows of Hawthorne Aviation Terminal, just outside Seattle. The polished marble floors reflected rows of sleek executive luggage, expensive leather briefcases, and men and women who moved with practiced confidence, each step measured by schedules instead of emotions. Maren Whitlock stood near Gate 3, clutching a worn leather notebook against her chest as she watched another message flash across her phone. Flight to Anchorage. On schedule. She sighed under her breath. 3 days in Alaska. 3 days trapped with the coldest billionaire in America. If there was one thing Maren had learned during the past 18 months as executive assistant to Declan Ashford, it was that working beside brilliance did not make it any warmer. Declan Ashford was the founder of Ashford Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing renewable technology companies in the country, worth billions before his 35th birthday. Business magazines called him visionary. Investors called him unstoppable. Employees called him efficient. Maren had another word for him. Impossible. She had watched him cancel vacations because deadlines mattered more. She had seen him remember every financial projection while forgetting birthdays, promotions, and simple congratulations. He never raised his voice. He never smiled without purpose. Every conversation sounded like another board meeting. Every thank you felt rehearsed. Some people admired discipline. Maren only saw loneliness wrapped inside an expensive tailored suit. She glanced toward the enormous windows overlooking the private runway. Rain drifted sideways across the tarmac while dark clouds swallowed the distant mountains. The weather forecast had warned about changing conditions, but billionaires rarely rearranged their calendars because of a storm. Their Gulfstream waited outside like a silver arrow ready to cut through the sky. Her fingers brushed the edge of the small brass compass resting inside her coat pocket. It had belonged to her grandfather, a park ranger who believed every person eventually became lost, not always in the woods, but somewhere inside themselves. Whenever she faced difficult decisions, she carried it with her. Today she suspected she would need the reminder. Footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Expensive Italian shoes. Calm, deliberate pace. No unnecessary movement. Declan Ashford walked past several executives who immediately straightened their posture without being asked. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly despite the rain collecting along the shoulders. In one hand he carried a weathered dark leather journal that looked strangely out of place beside everything else about him. He nodded once toward Maren. "Good morning." She answered with the same professional tone she had perfected months ago. "Morning." He looked briefly toward the runway before checking his watch. "We'll review tomorrow's presentation after takeoff." No hello. No comment about the weather. No asking whether she had slept well after preparing reports until nearly midnight. Just business. Always business. Maren forced a polite smile that disappeared the moment he turned away. She quietly followed him across the terminal, rolling her suitcase over polished stone. Sometimes she wondered if Declan even noticed people beyond what they could accomplish before the next deadline. A flight attendant welcomed them aboard with a friendly smile that seemed almost wasted on the billionaire, who thanked her with a simple nod before settling into his seat near the window. Maren sat across the aisle, opening her notebook while pretending not to notice how silent the spacious cabin felt despite its luxury. The engine slowly increased in volume as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Outside, sheets of rain blurred the world into shades of gray. Maren looked down at the brass compass resting in her palm before closing her fingers. Around it, across from her, Declan absent-mindedly opened the old leather journal, revealing pages filled not with financial numbers but neat handwritten notes she couldn't quite read before he gently closed it again. For just a second, she wondered why a man who trusted data more than people still carried something that looked so deeply personal. Before she could think any further, the captain's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. We may experience some weather during the first part of our flight, but everything remains well within normal operating conditions. Marin looked once more through the rain-covered window as the jet turned toward the runway, unaware that within a few hours titles, fortunes, and every opinion she had ever formed about the man sitting across from her would no longer matter at all. The first sign that something was wrong was not the turbulence. It was the silence that followed it. One moment the private jet sliced smoothly above the blanket of gray clouds, and the next every conversation inside the cabin faded as if the sky itself had taken a deep breath. Marin looked up from her notebook when the aircraft dipped just enough to send her pen rolling across the table. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft chime. Outside the oval window there was nothing but swirling clouds and sheets of icy rain. The mountains below had disappeared completely. A calm announcement came through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through an area of unexpected weather. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. The captain sounded composed, but Marin noticed one of the flight attendants tighten her grip on the nearest seat before forcing another reassuring smile. Across the aisle, Declan remained remarkably still. His attention rested on the leather journal in his lap, though he was no longer reading. His eyes had shifted toward the window, studying the storm with quiet concentration rather than fear. Another jolt shook the aircraft, stronger this time. The overhead compartments rattled softly, and a glass of sparkling water slid across the polished table before Marin caught. Just in time. She let out a nervous laugh that quickly disappeared when nobody else reacted. This is normal, she whispered to herself, although she was no longer certain she believed it. The jet climbed sharply before dropping again through another pocket of rough air. Her stomach tightened. She instinctively reached inside her coat and wrapped her fingers around the small brass compass. Its cool metal steadied her breathing just enough to slow the pounding in her chest. Declan finally looked toward her. You are afraid of flying. It was not a question. She frowned. Most people would be right now. He nodded once. Fear is useful if it helps you think clearly. She almost rolled her eyes. Even in the middle of a storm, he sounded like he was giving a leadership seminar. Before she could answer, the aircraft lurched sideways with enough force to make both of them grip their armrests. A few loose folders slipped from her bag and scattered across the carpet. The cabin lights flickered once before returning. Somewhere beyond the cockpit door, warning tones sounded briefly before falling silent again. Marin's breathing became shallow. This does not feel normal anymore. Declan unfastened his own notebook from the table and calmly helped gather the papers that had landed near his feet. Instead of handing them back immediately, he carefully organized every page in the correct order. Panic later, he said quietly. Right now, focus on what you can control. She stared at him in disbelief. You honestly think organizing paperwork matters right now? He met her eyes for the first time since they boarded. No. But keeping your mind occupied does. Before she could respond, the captain's voice returned, noticeably more serious than before. Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an unscheduled route adjustment due to rapidly changing weather conditions. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions. The words echoed through the suddenly quiet cabin. Nobody moved. Rain hammered against the windows hard enough to blur the outside world into darkness. The engine seemed louder now, straining against invisible currents. Minutes stretched endlessly. Every second felt heavier than the last. Marin noticed the flight attendant quietly securing loose equipment before taking her own seat. Even her practiced smile had disappeared. Another powerful jolt sent the aircraft downward for what felt like several long seconds before it steadied again. Marin instinctively reached across the aisle without thinking. Her hand landed against Declan's sleeve. Embarrassed, she immediately tried to pull away, but he gently placed his hand over hers for only a brief moment. His voice remained calm, almost surprisingly gentle. Look at me, not the window. She did. For the first time since she had started working for him, his face showed something other than perfect control. It was not panic. It was determination, mixed with an old sadness she could not explain. Whatever memories hid behind those gray eyes seemed to return with every flash of lightning outside. Then another sound reached them. Not thunder. A deep mechanical vibration unlike anything she had heard before. The aircraft shuddered again, longer this time while the engines changed pitch. Every passenger looked toward the cockpit. Nobody spoke. Declan slowly released her hand, tightened his own seat belt, and glanced once toward the old leather journal resting beside him before closing his eyes for a single quiet breath. Marin held the brass compass so tightly that its edges pressed into her palm. Somewhere beyond the storm, the world they understood was already slipping away, and neither of them realized that within the next few minutes, survival would become far more important than every meeting, every promotion, and every $1 billion waiting back home. The world did not end with an explosion. It ended with silence. Marin opened her eyes to the smell of damp pine, cold earth and rain-soaked leaves. For several long seconds she simply stared upward at towering evergreen branches swaying gently against a pale gray sky. Her ears rang, making everything sound distant, as though the forest itself were whispering instead of breathing. She blinked slowly, confused by the strange stillness surrounding her. The polished cabin, the conference reports, the soft leather seats had vanished. In their place stood towering trees stretching hundreds of feet into the mist. She inhaled sharply as reality settled over her. They were no longer flying. She pushed herself upright, every muscle protesting from the rough landing, but nothing seemed seriously injured except for a few bruises and a dull ache across her shoulder. Her suitcase rested several yards away, half buried beneath broken branches. The private jet had come to rest deep among the trees, remarkably intact considering the circumstances, its nose pressed into a hillside while one wing leaned awkwardly against massive pines. Steam drifted quietly from beneath the aircraft, disappearing into the cold morning air. "Declan," she called, her voice trembling more from uncertainty than fear. There was no answer. She stumbled toward the cabin entrance, carefully stepping over scattered luggage and pieces of torn insulation. The main door hung partially open. Inside, everything had shifted. Briefcases, blankets, and emergency equipment lay scattered across the floor. Then she saw him. Declan was sitting against one of the seats, conscious but breathing carefully, one hand pressed against his lower leg. Relief flooded through her before she remembered she was supposed to dislike this man. "Are you hurt?" she asked, kneeling beside him. He looked at her with surprising calm. "Nothing appears broken. My ankle disagrees with me." She almost smiled despite herself. "You can still make jokes?" "Not jokes," he answered quietly. "Observations." Together they carefully made their way outside. Declan leaned slightly on her shoulder as they walked, clearly putting as little weight as possible on his injured leg. It struck Marin as strangely unsettling. The man who normally strode through boardrooms without slowing now depended on her simply to cross uneven ground. Once they reached a fallen log, he sat down and surveyed the forest. "We should assess what we have before the weather changes." She stared at him in disbelief. "We almost died." He nodded. "Which is exactly why we need to think clearly." For the first time since joining his company, Marin realized his calmness was not arrogance. It was discipline. Together they searched the aircraft carefully. The emergency supplies had survived. Blankets, a first aid kit, flashlights, bottled water, a small survival pack containing waterproof matches, rope and a folding knife. Marin quietly thanked every engineer who had designed the aircraft with emergencies in mind. Declan found his weathered leather journal beneath one of the seats. He brushed away the dirt before slipping it carefully into his coat. She noticed he treated that journal with more care than anything else on board. Before leaving the aircraft, she searched beneath her own seat until her fingers closed around the familiar brass compass. Its surface was scratched, but the needle still pointed steadily north. She smiled with quiet relief. "Found something important?" Declan asked. She nodded. "My grandfather always said that as long as you know where north is, you have not completely lost your way." Declan looked at the compass for a long moment before answering softly. "He sounds like a wise man." The comment surprised her. It carried genuine respect instead of polite conversation. By late afternoon the rain had eased into a light mist, but the temperature continued to fall. Their phones showed no signal. The aircraft radio had been damaged. The emergency locator beacon had activated automatically, but neither of them knew whether anyone had received it. Rescue could arrive tomorrow, or next week, or not at all. They gathered fallen branches and built a simple shelter beside the aircraft where the trees offered some protection from the wind. Marin struggled with the waterproof matches until Declan quietly reached beside her. May I? She handed them over. Within minutes a small fire crackled between them, its orange glow pushing back the growing darkness. They divided one emergency meal packet into equal portions. Maren noticed Declan casually pushed the larger half toward her, while pretending not to notice the difference. She almost pointed it out but chose not to. Night settled slowly across the endless forest. Wolves did not howl. Bears did not appear. Only the steady rhythm of insects, distant birds, and the gentle crackling of fire reminded them they were no longer surrounded by glass towers and city lights. Maren wrapped herself inside one of the blankets and looked across the flames at the man she thought she understood. Somewhere during the longest day of her life, the billionaire had disappeared. Sitting quietly beside the fire was simply another exhausted human being trying to survive until morning. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through tall evergreens that turned the rising sun into thin ribbons of gold across the forest floor. Maren woke to the scent of pine needles and the faint crackle of dying embers. For one brief second she forgot where she was, expecting the familiar sound of city traffic outside her apartment window. Instead she found herself wrapped in an emergency blanket, staring at endless wilderness stretching in every direction. Across the fire, Declan was already awake. He sat on a fallen log with his injured ankle elevated on another piece of wood, carefully studying a hand-drawn map he had sketched inside his leather journal. His handwriting was precise, almost architectural. Every nearby stream, ridge, and landmark they had observed the previous afternoon had already been marked. Maren rubbed her eyes. "You have been awake for a while." He closed the journal. "About an hour. You should have rested." He offered a small shrug. "Planning helps me rest." She could not argue with that. They shared another emergency meal, dividing it exactly in half this time after Maren quietly noticed what he had done the night before. Neither of them mentioned it. Once breakfast ended, they began organizing their limited supplies. Declan suggested they remain close to the aircraft for another day, since rescue teams would likely search the planned flight path first. Maren agreed, although sitting still felt almost impossible. Doing nothing allowed fear to grow louder. Working gave both of them something to hold on to. Together they gathered larger branches to strengthen the shelter, filled empty bottles from a nearby stream after carefully boiling the water over the fire, and stacked dry firewood beneath a section of the damaged wing where it would remain protected from afternoon. Then, by midday, sweat replaced the morning chill despite the cool mountain air. Maren wiped dirt from her hands and looked toward Declan, who had quietly disappeared behind a cluster of trees carrying the folding knife. A few minutes later he returned with long, flexible branches balanced across his shoulder. "These should make the roof stronger," he said simply. She blinked in surprise. "How do you know how to build a shelter?" "I used to camp." "Used to?" For the first time he hesitated before answering. "A long time ago." His voice carried the weight of something unfinished. She sensed another question would only make him retreat, so she let the silence remain. By late afternoon, dark clouds drifted across the mountains again, bringing colder air with them. The wind picked up steadily, rustling the towering trees overhead. Maren wrapped her jacket tighter around herself while feeding another branch into the fire. "It is getting colder much faster than yesterday." Declan glanced toward the sky. "The temperature will probably drop below 40 degrees tonight." She swallowed. "That cold?" He nodded. "The mountains cool quickly after sunset." As darkness settled over the forest once more, the fire became their only island of warmth inside an ocean of shadows. They spoke very little, listening instead to distant owls and the whisper of wind moving through thousands of pine branches. Every unfamiliar sound reminded Maren how far they were from everything familiar. Hours passed before she noticed herself shivering despite the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She tried to hide it, rubbing her arms while staring into the flames, but Declan noticed anyway. "You are cold." "I am fine." He looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, you are trying to be polite." He pointed toward the shelter they had built together. "The blankets alone will not keep either of us warm enough tonight." She immediately understood what he meant. For a moment neither of them spoke. Back in Seattle they had barely exchanged conversations outside meeting schedules. Here the rules of normal life no longer seemed to apply. Survival demanded practical decisions instead of comfortable distance. Declan spoke first, his tone calm and respectful. Body heat is simply another resource. Nothing more. Maren studied his face. There was no awkwardness. No hidden intention. Only quiet concern. She gave a small nod. All right. They settled inside the shelter with a careful space between them at first, each wrapped in separate blankets while the fire glowed just outside the entrance. As the hours passed and the mountain air grew colder, the distance gradually disappeared without either of them mentioning it. The warmth was enough to stop the relentless shivering. For a long time they simply listened to the forest breathing around them. Then unexpectedly, Declan broke the silence. My father used to tell me that the wilderness never cares who you were before you entered it. Maren turned slightly toward him. Was he a camper too? A faint smile crossed Declan's face, softer than any expression she had ever seen in the office. He believed every trip into the mountains revealed the truth about a person. He stared into the darkness beyond the shelter. I never understood what he meant until now. Maren looked at the man she had spent nearly 2 years judging from behind conference room tables and office doors. Somewhere beneath the perfectly tailored suits and impossible standards was someone she had never actually taken the time to know. The forest had stripped away titles, wealth, and expectations, leaving behind only 2 ordinary people waiting together for the morning light. The third morning greeted them with clear skies for the first time since the accident, and the sunlight spilling through the towering pines almost made the forest seem welcoming instead of unforgiving. Maren stood beside the nearby stream filling their water bottles while the brass compass rested in her jacket pocket, its familiar weight becoming as comforting as the sound of running water. When she returned to camp, she found Declan carefully adjusting the bandage around his ankle. The swelling had gone down slightly, but every movement still carried a trace of pain that he never acknowledged aloud. "How is it today?" she asked. He tightened the wrap. Before standing slowly, "Better than yesterday. Not good enough to outrun anything with 4 legs." She laughed quietly, surprised by how natural it felt. A week ago she could barely imagine sharing a joke with him outside a conference room. After breakfast they decided to explore a ridge overlooking the valley, hoping to find a better location to signal any aircraft that might pass overhead. The climb was slow because of Declan's injury, but he refused to let her carry more than half of their supplies. Every few hundred yards he paused, not because he complained, but because his ankle demanded it. Maren noticed he always waited until she stopped first, pretending the break was for her instead of himself. The trail narrowed as it climbed through dense evergreens before opening onto a rocky overlook, nearly 500 feet above the forest floor. Endless mountains stretched across the horizon, layered in shades of blue and green beneath a brilliant sky. It was breathtaking, but it also revealed just how isolated they truly were. No roads, no cabins, no smoke, no signs of another human being. Maren quietly exhaled. I have never felt so small. Declan stood beside her, studying the distant peaks. Sometimes that is not a bad thing. She glanced toward him. You really believe that? He nodded slowly. When everything around you is bigger than your problems become easier to understand. His words lingered in the cool mountain air. They remained on the overlook for several minutes before continuing along the ridge. Around midday they reached a narrow clearing where wild berries grew beneath scattered bushes. Declan knelt carefully beside them, examining the leaves before picking only a handful. Edible, he said. How do you know all this? She asked again. This time he did not avoid the question. He looked down at the berries resting in his hand before speaking. My father brought me into the mountains every summer when I was a boy. No phones. No meetings. Just the 2 of us. Maren listened quietly as they continued walking. His voice remained steady, but something had changed. The distance he usually placed between himself and the world seemed to soften with every sentence. He believed nature stripped away excuses, Declan continued. Out here, you cannot impress anyone with money or titles. You either help each other, or you fail together. Maren smiled gently. He sounds like someone I would have liked. Declan looked ahead instead of at her. You would have. Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt comfortable instead of awkward. A few minutes later they stopped beside a fallen cedar to rest. Declan opened the weathered leather journal and carefully removed an old photograph tucked inside the back cover. The edges were worn from years of being handled. He studied it for several seconds before quietly handing it to Marin. The picture showed a younger Declan, perhaps 10 years old, smiling beside a man with kind eyes and a fishing hat, both standing near a mountain lake. It was the first photograph she had ever seen of him where his smile looked completely unguarded. "Your father?" she asked softly. Declan nodded. "This was our last trip together." His gaze drifted toward the distant mountains. A few months later he boarded a small business plane during a storm. It never reached its destination. Marin felt her heart tighten. Suddenly every piece of the man she thought she understood began fitting together in an entirely different way. The relentless schedules, the obsession with preparation, the emotional distance, the need to control every detail. They had never been signs of arrogance. They had been armor. Declan continued speaking almost as though he had forgotten she was there. "After he died, people kept telling me time would heal everything. It did not. Time simply taught me how to hide it better." Marin looked down at the photograph before carefully returning it to him. "You never stopped missing him." He gave a faint smile that barely reached his eyes. "No. I just became successful enough that nobody asked anymore." She sat beside him on the fallen cedar without saying anything else. Some grief could not be solved with words. It only needed someone willing to stay. As the afternoon sun filtered through the trees, Marin realized the man beside her was no longer the billionaire she had resented for nearly 2 years. He was simply a son who had built an empire because he could not rebuild the one relationship he had lost. And for the first time since this impossible journey began, she understood that the coldness she had hated was never the whole truth. The next 2 days settled into a quiet rhythm that neither of them could have imagined back in Seattle. Every sunrise brought another list of practical tasks. Collect water. Gather firewood. Check the emergency beacon. Search the sky. Every sunset reminded them they had survived one more day together. Somewhere between necessity and routine, the invisible wall that had separated employer and employee slowly disappeared. Marin no longer hesitated to tease Declan whenever he insisted on carrying more than his share despite his healing ankle. He no longer answered every question with a businesslike sentence. Instead, he occasionally smiled, and every rare smile transformed his face so completely that she wondered why he had hidden it from the world for so many years. On the 5th afternoon, the weather changed again. Thick clouds rolled over the mountains faster than expected, bringing sharp gusts of wind that bent the tops of the evergreens. They decided to gather extra firewood before another storm arrived. Marin ventured a short distance farther than usual, following a fallen tree that seemed to lead toward a cluster of dry branches beneath a rocky ledge. She had almost filled her arms when her right foot slipped on damp moss hidden beneath the leaves. She caught herself before falling, but her ankle twisted awkwardly against the uneven ground. A sharp sting forced her to sit down immediately. She closed her eyes, taking several slow breaths before trying to stand again. The pain was manageable, but walking felt difficult. Before she could call out, she heard Declan's voice somewhere behind the trees. "Marin," she answered, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "I am over here." Seconds later he appeared through the pines, concern replacing his usual composed expression the moment he saw her sitting on the forest floor. He knelt beside her without hesitation. "What happened?" "I slipped. I think I twisted my ankle." He gently examined the injury with careful movements, never causing unnecessary discomfort. "Can you move your foot?" She nodded and slowly rotated it. It hurt, but she could still move it. Relief softened his features. "That is a good sign." Using strips from the first aid kit, he wrapped the ankle securely before helping her stand. When she tried taking a few steps, she immediately leaned against the nearest tree. Declan watched her for a moment before making a decision. "Do not argue." "About what?" "Lean on me." She hesitated. "Your ankle is still healing too. Then we will both limp together." She laughed despite herself. That is probably the least inspiring thing a billionaire has ever said. It is still accurate. They slowly made their way back toward camp, each supporting the other across the uneven trail. Progress was slow, but neither complained. By the time they reached the shelter, Rain had already begun tapping softly against the branches overhead. Marin settled beside the fire while Declan added another log before checking the bandage one more time. "You should keep it elevated tonight," he said. "Dr. Ashford," she teased. "Temporary forest medic. Your bedside manner could use improvement. I have never had much practice." His answer came so naturally that both of them smiled. Evening settled gently around the camp. Rain whispered against the trees while the fire filled the shelter with steady warmth. Marin watched Declan quietly writing inside his leather journal. Curiosity finally overcame her. "May I ask what you write every night?" He looked at the notebook before handing it to her without a word. She accepted it carefully, expecting business ideas or survival notes. Instead, she found page after page describing ordinary moments. The sound of rain before sunrise. The way smoke drifted through pine branches. The courage he saw in someone who kept smiling despite uncertainty. One sentence caught her attention immediately. "I spent years building a company and forgot how to simply notice another human being." Her eyes lingered on the words before she slowly looked up. "You wrote this today?" He nodded. "Some lessons require unusual classrooms." She closed the journal gently. "You know, everyone at the office thinks you never notice us." Declan stared into the fire. "That is because I convinced myself caring too much only made losing people harder." Marin remained silent for a long moment before reaching into her pocket and placing the brass compass between them. "My grandfather used to say something similar after my grandmother died. One day he finally realized avoiding love only guaranteed loneliness." Declan picked up the compass, turning it slowly in the firelight before returning it to her open hand. Their fingers brushed for only an instant, but neither pulled away immediately. No words followed. None were necessary. The fire crackled softly as rain continued falling beyond the shelter, wrapping the forest in peaceful silence. Somewhere in the distance, a faint mechanical sound drifted across the mountains. Marin looked toward the dark sky, uncertain whether she had imagined it. Declan listened carefully, his expression suddenly alert. It lasted only a few seconds before disappearing into the wind, leaving both of them wondering whether hope had finally found its way back to the forgotten corner of the wilderness where two strangers had slowly become something neither of them expected. The sound returned just after sunrise, faint at first, almost blending with the wind sweeping across the mountaintops. Marin froze beside the fire, tilting her head as the distant hum echoed through the valley once again. This time Declan heard it too. Neither of them spoke. They simply looked toward the pale blue sky filtering through the endless canopy. "Aircraft," Declan said quietly. The single word carried more hope than anything either of them had allowed themselves to feel for days. Within seconds they moved together without discussing a plan. Marin grabbed one of the emergency blankets with its reflective silver lining while Declan gathered dry branches they had saved beneath the damaged wing. He ignored the lingering pain in his ankle as he limped toward the highest clearing they had discovered earlier in the week. Marin followed as quickly as her own. Healing ankle allowed. The forest suddenly seemed much steeper than before. Every fallen log another obstacle standing between them and the possibility of rescue. When they finally reached the rocky overlook, Declan immediately built a large pile of branches while Marin spread the reflective blanket across the open ground where sunlight struck it directly. The humming grew louder. Somewhere beyond the mountains, an aircraft was approaching. Declan struck the waterproof matches, shielding the tiny flame with both hands until the dry pine needles caught. Within moments, thick white smoke rose steadily into the cool morning air. Both of them stepped into the clearing, waving the silver blanket high above their heads. The aircraft remained invisible for what felt like forever. Then suddenly, a small helicopter appeared beyond the distant ridgeline, moving slowly across the valley. Marin's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. "Over here!" she shouted instinctively, though she knew they were far too distant to hear her voice. The helicopter continued forward without changing direction. Hope began slipping away almost as quickly as it had arrived. Then the aircraft banked gently to one side. Circled once. Then again lower this time. Declan never took his eyes off the helicopter. "They see us." Marin felt tears gather before she even realized she was crying. She laughed and cried at the same time as the helicopter completed another slow circle overhead before disappearing behind the mountains once more. Why are they leaving? She asked anxiously. Declan rested a reassuring hand against her shoulder. To bring the rescue team to a safe landing area. Less than an hour later, the steady chopping of rotor blades filled the valley again. This time the helicopter descended into a nearby clearing, while emergency responders hurried toward them with bright orange equipment and calm, practiced voices. Questions came quickly. Were they injured? How long had they been there? Did anyone else survive? Marin answered as best she could, but everything blurred together beneath overwhelming relief. Before boarding the helicopter, she turned back one final time. Their small shelter still stood beneath the pines. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The place that had frightened her only days earlier somehow looked strangely familiar now. Declan walked beside her, carrying his weathered leather journal in one hand. Without saying anything, he glanced toward the shelter for several quiet seconds before climbing aboard. Hours later, the endless green forest gave way to city skylines, hospitals, flashing cameras, and a world that had spent nearly a week wondering whether the billionaire entrepreneur and his assistant had survived. The moment they landed, reporters crowded behind security barriers, while company executives rushed forward. Doctors insisted on examinations before either of them could leave. Everything happened so quickly that neither Marin nor Declan found a chance to speak privately. By evening they were back in Seattle. Declan returned to his penthouse overlooking the city lights. Marin unlocked the door to her apartment for the first time in days. The silence inside felt unfamiliar now. She placed the brass compass on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before realizing the forest no longer felt farther away than the city outside her window. The following Monday, Ashford Dynamics resumed business as though the world had never stopped turning. Employees whispered excitedly about the miraculous rescue, while reporters continued covering every detail of the story. Marin stood outside the executive floor holding a neatly organized envelope. When Declan arrived, dressed once again in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he looked almost exactly like the man she had worked for before the accident. Almost. Their eyes met across the hallway, and for one brief moment the mountains returned between them. Then office doors opened, assistants hurried past carrying schedules, and the invisible walls of corporate life quietly rose once again. Marin stepped forward, handed him the envelope, and spoke with calm professionalism. "This is my resignation." Declan accepted the envelope without opening it. For several seconds he simply looked at Marin, searching her face for the determined expression he had seen. Only once before, the morning she insisted on climbing the ridge despite exhaustion. "Is this because of what happened in the forest?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "It is because of what happens here." She glanced around the executive floor where employees hurried past with tablets, coffee cups, and tightly packed schedules. "Out there, we were just two people trying to make it through another day. In here, you are my boss again, and I do not know how to pretend those days never happened." Before Declan could answer, his chief operating officer approached carrying a folder filled with briefing notes. "The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Every major shareholder is already here. The media is waiting downstairs for a statement." Declan lowered his eyes to the unopened resignation letter before slipping it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "We will discuss this later." Marin offered a polite smile, the same professional smile she had perfected months before the accident. "There is nothing left to discuss." She turned and walked toward the elevator without looking back. The boardroom overlooking downtown Seattle was filled beyond capacity. Directors, investors, legal advisors, and senior executives waited quietly while camera crews prepared for the company's first public appearance since the rescue. Every news outlet wanted to hear how the billionaire had survived against impossible odds. Declan stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, but instead of reviewing financial reports, he found himself staring at the reflection of a man he barely recognized. His tailored suit fit exactly as it always had. His watch still measured every passing second. Yet none of those things felt important anymore. His thoughts drifted back to smoke rising through pine trees, shared meals beside a small fire, and a brass compass catching the morning sunlight. The meeting began precisely on schedule. Applause filled the room as Declan stepped to the podium. Reporters raised cameras while television lights illuminated the stage. One journalist asked about the rescue. Another asked how the experience would affect the company's future. Declan answered politely, but his voice lacked the polished certainty everyone expected. Then another reporter stood. "Mr. Ashford, many people have described your survival as a miracle. What do you believe made the greatest difference?" The room fell completely silent. Declan paused longer than anyone expected. Finally, he stepped away from the prepared speech lying on the podium. "A person," he answered. "Not a miracle. A person." Curious whispers spread across the audience. Declan continued, speaking without notes for the first time in his professional career. "For years I believed leadership meant having every answer. I believed strength meant never depending on anyone else. I was wrong. During the most difficult week of my life, the person who kept me moving was someone I had spent almost 2 years taking for granted." Every employee in the room knew exactly who he meant. Cameras immediately shifted toward the audience where Maren sat quietly in the back, having attended only because human resources requested her presence until her resignation became official. She lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the unexpected attention. Declan walked away from the podium entirely until he stood only a few feet from her seat. "Maren Whitlock did far more than help me survive. She reminded me what kind of man I wanted to become long before I ever became a billionaire." The room remained silent except for the clicking of cameras. Declan reached into his jacket, removed the unopened resignation envelope, and held it up with a gentle smile. "I have no intention of accepting this." Soft laughter rippled through the audience. He continued before anyone could interrupt. "Instead, today Ashford Dynamics is establishing the Ashford Wilderness Resilience Foundation, dedicated to supporting search and rescue organizations, emergency preparedness education, and families affected by aviation emergencies across the country." A large screen behind him illuminated with the foundation's logo. "The foundation will be led by someone who understands courage better than I ever did." He turned toward Maren. "If she is willing." Every eye in the room followed his gaze. Maren slowly stood speechless. Declan reached into another pocket and carefully removed a familiar object. It was the weathered leather journal he had carried through the forest. Tucked inside its pages was the small brass compass she thought she had left behind in her apartment after returning home. He held it out with both hands. "You once told me that as long as you know where north is, you have not completely lost your way. I think you helped me find mine." Maren accepted the compass with trembling hands, unable to hide the tears filling her eyes. At that moment, the applause that filled the boardroom had nothing to do with billion-dollar companies or successful business leaders. It was for two people who had walked out of the wilderness carrying something far more valuable than survival itself. 1 year later, the mountains welcomed them back with the same quiet dignity they had shown on the day everything changed. Early autumn had painted the forest in deep shades of green and gold, while the crisp morning air carried the familiar scent of pine and fresh earth. Maren stepped carefully along the narrow trail, smiling as she recognized landmarks that once represented uncertainty, but now felt strangely comforting. Beside her, Declan walked without a limp, carrying only a small backpack and the weathered leather journal that had become more than a notebook. It had become a reminder of the man he chose to become. They reached the clearing where their shelter had once stood. Nature had already reclaimed most of it. Moss covered the fallen logs they had arranged together, and young wildflowers grew where the fire pit had once warmed them through long mountain nights. Time had erased almost every physical trace of their stay, but neither of them needed visible reminders. The memories had already become part of who they were. Maren looked toward the open sky above the trees and smiled softly. "It feels smaller now." Declan glanced around the clearing before answering. "No. We simply stopped being afraid of it." She laughed quietly. "That sounds exactly like something you would have said before all of this happened." He shook his head with a smile that came easily now. "Before all of this happened, I would have been too busy checking my watch to notice the trees." They sat together on the same large fallen cedar where they had once shared stories neither expected to tell. The Ashford Wilderness Resilience Foundation had already funded dozens of rescue teams across the country, provided emergency equipment to remote communities, and helped families facing the same uncertainty they had survived together. Maren had transformed the foundation into something far greater than either of them first imagined. She insisted that every training program begin with one simple message. Preparation saves lives, but kindness gives people the strength to keep going. Declan often attended those events quietly, sitting in the back instead of standing on stage. Success no longer required applause. It required purpose. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the towering evergreens, Maren reached into her jacket pocket and removed the familiar brass compass. Its surface carried a few more scratches than before, but the needle still pointed steadily north. She placed it gently in Declan's hand. "I think it belongs with you today." He looked down at the compass before carefully opening it. Maren frowned in surprise. Hidden inside, where the small backing had once rested, was a simple diamond ring secured safely beneath the brass cover. She looked up in complete disbelief. Declan smiled with the quiet confidence she had come to love. "Your grandfather believed that as long as you knew where north was, you were never completely lost." He took a slow breath before continuing. "You became my north." Tears immediately filled Maren's eyes as the forest around them seemed to disappear into peaceful silence. There were no reporters, no board members, no photographers waiting for the perfect picture. Only birds singing somewhere high above and sunlight dancing across the trees. Declan gently held both of her hands. "I spent years building companies because I thought achievement could fill every empty place inside me. Then one unexpected journey taught me that home is not a building, a city, or even a destination. Home is the person who walks beside you when everything else disappears." His voice remained steady, but his eyes revealed every emotion he once believed he had to hide. "Maren Whitlock, will you spend the rest of your life walking beside me?" She laughed through happy tears before answering without hesitation. "Yes. Always yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger as they embraced beneath the towering pines that had witnessed the beginning of a story neither of them could have planned. Months later, family and close friends gathered for a small outdoor wedding overlooking a peaceful mountain lake not far from where Declan's father had once taught his young son how to read the wilderness. The ceremony was simple, filled with laughter instead of luxury. Near the entrance stood a glass display containing two quiet reminders of the journey that had brought them there. One held the weathered leather journal open to the page that read, "I spent years building a company and forgot how to simply notice another human being." The other displayed the brass compass beneath a small engraved plaque that read, "Sometimes the greatest direction in life comes from the person you never expected to follow." As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, Maren slipped her hand into Declan's, and together they walked toward the future they had built not through wealth, status, or perfect plans, but through trust, compassion, and the courage to let another heart become home. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Chosen by Love for more unforgettable billionaire romance stories filled with hope, courage, and life-changing love. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt journeys to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.